to boost peak performance, even if studying is a struggle for your child. All right, so let's get started. Over the years, over the last 25 years, first as a teacher in Fairfax County, and then as a tutor, and now as the head of a team of almost 200 tutors, I've worked with hundreds of kids. And I can tell you that when kids have difficulty with studying, it's always for a reason. It's never because they just don't care or they don't want to get a good grade. There's usually something getting in their way. I've categorized these issues into three different types of kids. First are the kids that are bright but disorganized. And these kids often are completely unprepared for studying. They haven't taken good notes. They haven't even done much with their notes, and sometimes they can't find their notes. They haven't fully completed the study guide. Sometimes they can't locate the study guide, but they're just not on top of things because of their issues with organization. Then we have the kids with subject struggles, and we often see that these things happen in these cumulative areas like math and science. And often what happens is that kids will lose confidence and they'll get behind, especially in math. So when they have an upcoming test, first of all, they're not always sure how to study, but they don't have the skills and haven't mastered the content to practice correctly. So that's why they often don't study and start to give up and lose motivation. And then lastly, we have the kids that are stressed out perfectionists. These kids actually study, and they study a lot. The problem is they study inefficiently. It's not uncommon for parents to call our office and they'll say, my child's really frustrated. He spent 3 hours studying for this test and he thought he should have gotten a high A, and instead he got a B minus, or sometimes they'll say a C. And it's often because these kids are passive studiers. So we'll talk about all three of these issues today. Well, here's the thing. The way in which you study really does matter. The problem is that kids just don't do it right most of the time. In a survey of mostly high school students, some middle, they said that they study primarily by rereading. That's right, 83% of kids said they study by taking the information they have and reading it again, and reading it lots and lots of times until they've committed it to memory. The problem is this is super passive. It's not active. So sometimes they can do okay the next day on a quiz or a test, but they haven't really retained the information for long-term use. There's a great book called Make It Stick. And if you haven't heard of this book, take a look at it. It has been on the top of the New York Times bestseller list for a while. And it's really about how people learn, not just kids, but adults too. And we know that so many people, not just kids, but adults as well, just reread to learn information, as I mentioned before. And they develop this illusion of knowing. And an illusion of knowing is when you think you know the information and you've studied your heart out, but you don't know it at a deeper level. And so you don't often do as well as you can do. And we see this the most when students have to take a cumulative test. Like, it's not just they have to study on Thursday for a quiz on Friday, but they have to take a midterm or a final exam or a unit test. That's often where we see these studying issues come to fruition, because they have this illusion of thinking they know it, but they really don't. In order to really know something, learning must be deep. It has to be deep. And a lot of times we tell kids, actually, you don't need to study that hard to learn something. You just have to put the time in. But that's not true at all. Research shows that learning actually requires effort. It's not just about time, but it's the way that you study and the effort that you make your brain produce that has the greatest impact. So what are these 3 steps to peak performance that, if kids used them, they would get better grades? Well, let's see what they are. The first one is quizzing yourself. So I mentioned before that many times kids use the activity of just rereading something. But instead, if they took their study guide, or if they took their worksheet with questions and answers and they covered up the answers and they just asked themselves the question, and out loud is better than silent, helps you remember more. And they quizzed themselves and said, what was the first settlement, the first English settlement? They can recite Jamestown. Just simply asking yourself the question and then stating the answer is so much better for retention, both short and long term, than just reading what was the first English colony, Jamestown. That is not nearly as good. So quizzing yourself is super important. It's active learning. Let's talk a little bit about that. So you can quiz yourself lots of different ways. One way is through study guides. Study guide is when your teacher gives you a list of what may be on the test with lots of questions and answers. And what often kids do is they'll take the study guide home or in class and they'll complete it, and then they'll reread all of the correct answers over and over and then pronounce, I've studied. But actually, yeah, they have studied. Yes, they have put in the time, but it may not get them that grade. So a better way to use study guides is, one, the easy way is just to simply cover up the answer and ask yourself the question until you know it. But a better way even is to make a couple of blank copies of that study guide. And so you've done it one time with all the correct answers. So your second study guide, you fill in the blanks by actually writing it out, because writing is super powerful for retention. It's actually better than self-quizzing. It's a form of self-quizzing. You're asking yourself the question, but this time you're writing out the answer, and then you go on to the next one. You fill as much of the study guide out as you can until you can do no more. And then at that point, you can go look at the correct answers and fill in the rest. Now, the next day or a couple days later, you'll want to do the third copy. And this is really where you cement learning, because now at this point, you should do most of it. The reason study guides work is twofold. First, it makes you write. And anytime you write, now you're using more modalities. You're not just looking and reading, but you're also writing. And if you're talking out loud, you've got that auditory component as well. So study guides can be really powerful tools for learning. So what about math? What do you do with math? First of all, it's completely different. You know, you can't quiz yourself. What was the first permanent settlement? It doesn't really go like that. But what you can do is find practiced questions that you've solved before and you have the solution and the steps written down, not just the answer. And you can find these from your notes in class, from examples in your book. And what you want to do is take different types of these questions and create your own little study guide. And then make sure they're mixed up. Studies actually show that, let's say you're working with a little kid and they're, just because this is a simple example, they're practicing their multiplication facts. Well, you could practice the multiplication facts by saying, we're just going to practice fours in this section of the study guide. Then we're going to practice fives, and then we're going to practice the six tables. But actually, even though it's harder for your brain at the time, if you take the fours, fives, and sixes and you mix up all the problems and have the kid go through and solve them, you come out better on the other end, because you're forcing your brain to expend more energy, not more time, just more energy. And whenever you do that, learning is deeper. So just that one change can make a huge difference in output. And studies show kids that do this have much better grades. So take different types of problems, mix them up, and then go through and solve the first problem. If you can't work it, then you can go back and look at the example and the solution, and then rework it again to be sure you really know it. So quizzing yourself, practice tests, study guides, all of these things are really important. In the second, I mentioned there's two reasons these things are important. The second one is that they really do increase GPA. In fact, when all the study skills were measured across the board, like note-taking and practice tests and pacing yourself, it was the practice tests that produced the highest increase in GPA, grade point average, than anything else. All right, here's number 2. Know thyself. Basically, it means that you have to know what kind of learner you are and study that way in order to be successful and get good grades. we teach our kids when, we call it tutors that help kids learn study skills and be more organized and reduce procrastination, all those soft skills that aren't always taught in school. We call them educational coaches. And for many of our students, what we first do is teach them about themselves. We ask them to be a detective, to figure out not only which study methods work for them, but other things like where are you going to study? When are you going to study? When are you freshest? When do you feel best? And when are you most productive? But anyways, when you're a detective, you can figure out what works best for you through trial and error often. That's always better than being told what to do, and doing that repetitively. I actually did an informal study of high school students, all of whom had ADHD. And I asked them, I know studying can be hard for you. What are the ways that you've studied that you've found that you get better grades and they're the easiest methods for you, especially when you don't feel like studying? And they said a lot of different things, but it was interesting. The two things every kid said was that they use Quizlet and they use the practice test that I just talked about in step number 1. So Quizlet, if you don't know about it, is just, it's an app, it's a website. It's basically a way for kids to practice just about anything, but it's especially good for vocabulary and learning, for example, your Spanish terms. And it allows you to make flashcards of words and their definitions or the answers and be able to play games and quiz yourself. So Quizlet is a great option, and I love it because when kids are super busy and they don't have much time, or they have these weird gaps of time when maybe they're waiting in the dentist office for their orthodontist to meet with them, they have 10 minutes, they can go to Quizlet and practice studying for a test, practice those terms. So Quizlet was one practice test. And the other thing was interesting. A couple of kids said, you know what, I know that I study better here and when I'm and at this time. And I had one student tell me that he actually, even though he didn't love it at the time, he found that if he got to work right after school, he was a little bit fresher than late at night. Even though he tended to stay up later at night, he found that if he didn't do some of it after school and before dinner in that little block of time, he was much more likely to put it off. And so that was he figured that out for himself because he found that he actually procrastinated more the further he pushed things off, even when he wanted to do it. I've had other kids say that I work best at the library. And one kid said, yeah, my mom started taking me to the library when I was in 9th grade. And now after school, if I have some time, I'll go to the library and I'll work there. So really trying to figure out for kids where they work best, when they work best is ideal. Because if they can come up with the answer, it's so much better than us telling them what to do. So part of our coaching service is really helping kids to figure that out. At the end of the day, in order to study efficiently, kids have to regulate focus. So if you've been on a webinar before, I've probably shared some of these things with you before, but I want to share them with you again because kids still bring them up all these years later, even after I first introduced them to parents. And these are applications for them to stay focused while they're working on their laptop. Because kids all the time, they'll say, it's just so distracting. You know, I want to watch the show on Netflix, or I want to watch these videos on YouTube, or I found myself down a rabbit hole of Reddit, whatever it is. So self-control is for Mac. Stay Focused is a Chrome extension. And both of them allow kids to blacklist the websites they deem distracting and then move a toggle bar a certain amount of time. So for example, let's say they don't want to go on Reddit or Yahoo Fantasy Sports for 20 minutes. They'll move the toggle bar for 20 minutes, and no matter what they do, disable the app, restart their computer, they cannot go to those websites. So it really does give them focused study time. This is one for phones that kids really like a lot. It's called Forest. It allows kids to pretty much do the same thing, set an amount of time that they do not want to look at their phone, they don't want to Snapchat, they don't want to Instagram, and say 35 minutes, and no matter what they do, actually I shouldn't say that. If they do go to Snapchat, for example, the app will not work in the way they want it to. So the way that this app works is when you set the bar for a certain amount of time, say 35 minutes, a tree on the home screen grows, and it grows these beautiful leaves, these big branches. It gets bigger and bigger. But if any time the kid leaves that application and goes to, say, Snapchat, the tree will wither and die. So it's super motivating to kids because they can allow themselves to stay focused for that brief amount of time in order to study and not be on other apps on their phone. Also, kids have to feel like they can do this. They have to feel like they don't need to put 3 hours into studying in order to be successful. This was a few years ago. I worked with a girl who had basically been on academic probation at Christopher Newport College University, and she had come home and she basically decided that it wasn't going well. She wanted a fresh start. She came home. She went to George Mason, and she was having the same difficulties even with a new college. And so we started talking, and I asked her, tell me a little bit how you study. What are your steps? And she said, well, I found that I'm actually really focused on the library. And I said, okay. And she said, so what I do is I take all my things and I go to the library and I set up my study space in a cubicle, and I'll make sure that I'm there for at least 3 hours so I can get a lot done. I said, okay, well, that sounds good. Tell me what happens. And she said, that's the problem. Not a lot. I just can't make myself get focused enough. And I feel like at the end of 3 hours, I have very little to show for it. And she was actually much more emotional than I'm depicting. She was upset with herself that she couldn't make herself do the work. She couldn't make herself sit there and study. And first of all, I was really proud that she was able to articulate what was getting in her way. But secondly, she just assumed that she could block out all this time and make herself focused. But that's not really how your brain works. In fact, we know that after about a half hour, your brain starts to lose its ability to stay organized and focused on the task. And then after 50 minutes, your motivation completely drops off. So it's not really that it was her. It was the way in which she was going about it and her expectations for herself. So we started this whole new method. And what we did is I had her get a timer, not her phone, but another timer. This is an example. This is one called the time timer that I used to get this for little kids, and then I found that older kids like it too. But I like it because it's a visual depiction. It's got a red disc, and you can buy them. They're real small, about this big. It could be a kitchen timer. It can be anything. But the idea is that you want to set the timer for a very short period of time, never more than a half hour. And you say to yourself, I'm going to complete the study guide and work as best as I can and focus as much as I can for, say, 20 minutes. And after that, when the timer goes off, after that, I can take a break or I can keep on going. Usually they can keep on going. But for this student, she never thought about chunking her time. And it was the one thing. We tried lots of things, but this was the one thing that had the biggest positive impact on her. For other kids, they do better when they can say, you know what, I'm going to do this math, and then I'm going to give myself a break before I start my history assignment. So you can chunk time. You can chunk your assignments not just by time, but also by task. Let me do the easy ones on this math homework, and I'll take a break, and then I'll start to tackle the harder ones. The third thing is that we know that timing has a huge impact on retention and studying for exams. The frequency of studying is super important. You know, kids all the time say, hey, Mrs. Dolan, cramming totally works for me. I get good grades when I cram. And I'll say, that's great. Tell me about that. And they'll tell me all these things about how they studied at 10 o'clock at night for this exam on Thursday night. That was on Friday morning. But then I'll start to ask them some other questions. Tell me about your midterm exam. How did that go? What happened on your final exam? And the more I talk to them, that's where they fall off. Yes, they can cram and do okay the next day, but that method doesn't work long term. So the frequency in which you study a little bit over time is always better than the night before. So let's say you have a test on Friday, you study Thursday night, you do okay, that's fine. But if you took that hour that you would study on Thursday night and you broke it up into 20 minutes Tuesday, 20 Wednesday, 20 Thursday, you would actually not only probably get a better grade on Friday, but what you would get is a better grade later on because you're reviewing it more and you're sleeping on it. Sleep is a very powerful study skill that kids often don't even think about. They completely undervalue sleep, but sleep can help you get better grades. And that's because when you sleep on something, you're really consolidating that information through rehashing those memories into long-term memory. There's also this thing called the forgetting curve, which is super powerful. You know, when kids are in class, if you ask them right at that moment, tell me what your teacher just said, for the majority of students can just tell you what happened. They can retain much of the knowledge right away. So if the teacher says, what was the first settlement? Jamestown, they can say, yeah, the first settlement was Jamestown. Great. All right, here's the problem. After one day of doing nothing with that information, you lose, not just kids, but adults too, about 50% of what you learned at that lesson. It gets worse. On day 2, you only know about 36%. And by day 4, you know about 18%. A week later, at day 7, you only know 10% of what you learned on that first day. This is called the forgetting curve, and it's normal. This is what happens to everybody if they don't do something with the information. Kids ask me all the time, what's the best way to take notes? Should I type the notes? Should I handwrite the notes? Should I use the Cornell note-taking system? Should I do pictures? What should I do? You know what? The answer is kind of going back to that detective prop question. How do you like to take notes? What do you like to do? When do you find that you can get the most information, those important parts down? That's the way you should do it. But actually, the way in which you take notes isn't really the most important thing. It's actually what you do with that information. So if you take that information and within 24 hours, you say to yourself, let's say you have 3 pages of notes, all right, for this topic on my first page of notes, what was really important that I need to know? And you go back and you review your notes, and then you just take like a minute or 2 to consolidate the information, to basically summarize what's important in 1, 2, or 3 sentences at the bottom of your paper or in the margins or whatever. Just that alone, which isn't a lot of time at all, can seriously negate the forgetting curve. So we always encourage kids, you know, when you take notes, if you have a tough class, maybe if you're doing super well in a class that you naturally retain the information more, you might not need to use this strategy. But let's say history is really tough for you. This would be a really good strategy for history within 24 hours to just consolidate some basic information of your notes. And even if you refuse to write something down, although it's not ideal, it's better than nothing, rereading your notes. But if you do a little bit each day, even if you do something within 24 hours and then you do something 3-4 days later, you're going to know it so much more after a week or when that quiz comes. So when it comes to how we help our kids, you know, we can say, hey, Jimmy, I was just on this webinar and Ann Dolan said you should do this. If your kids are like mine, they're not going to listen to you. You know, a better thing is if we ask them questions instead of telling them what to do. There's this really good book called The Coaching Habit, which I really like. It's really for dealing with other people, and instead of telling them what to do, just a little bit less, you ask them just a few more questions. And I find that works great for kids. So instead of saying, did you study for your science test? Or, oh, don't you have a big exam tomorrow? You might say, break it down. What is the first thing you might do to get ready for that science test? That's a lot easier asking kids a what question. I like what questions, because then it doesn't feel like, oh, that science test, it's so big and overwhelming. I'll just avoid it, which is what a lot of kids do. But instead, if you say, what's one little thing you can do to get ready? Often kids will start to break down in their heads what is something small they can do to get ready. And, don't expect them to say, well, Mom, actually, what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to take all my notes and I'm going to lay them out. And then I'm going to look for the commonalities and ask myself how this topic relates to this topic. They're not going to say that. They may not even answer you, but it does get their executive functions churning and going so they can start to think what they might do first, second, or even third. So on our website, we have lots of these powerful questions. I love them. I find that they work just great with kids. You got to do them consistently, though. So if you say, I'm going to ask powerful questions today and then never else again, probably not going to work that well. But if you can just slowly, just a little bit, from day to day, ask a couple of questions, it can have really positive results. So on our website, it's ectutoring.com/powerful-questions. So, Rochelle, let's do Q&A. Do you have anything that, and I forgot to mention earlier, parents, write in your questions if you have them right now, and I will answer them. I had one that came in earlier. Rochelle, do you have anything right now? If not, I'll read that one question I had.
Yeah, the one question so far is, and you probably brushed upon it earlier, but what's the best way to study for different subjects? I know you mentioned math, but what would be a good way to study for a history?
Rochelle, I'm so sorry. I can't hear you. I'm having a hard time with the audio. So just to waste everybody's time, let me do this. Let me just share that question. And then if we can get the audio working, I'll come back to you. And if not, that's okay too.
Great.
I had a parent write in. She said, I can't be on the webinar, but I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about learning styles. My child says he's only a visual learner. Learning styles were in vogue for a really long time. And learning styles have to do with the three modalities of learning: auditory, visual, and kinesthetic. So auditory is like when you're discussing something with somebody. You learn it better if you discuss than if you just read, for example. I always encourage kids to get on FaceTime, to get on Skype, whatever, Google Hangouts. And if you have a test coming up and you've got a study guide, practice it with each other. That's a great way to learn from somebody else. That's why study groups are super powerful in college and why kids use them so much, because they work. So auditory is one. Visual is another. People that say they're visual learners, they like PowerPoints, they like graphs, they like diagrams, they like pictures. So that's another way, visual. And it also includes reading. And then we have kinesthetic. And people that say, I'm just a hands-on learner, those are the people that say, oh, I like science experiments and I like putting things together. But another kinesthetic way of learning is writing. Because that is kinesthetic. You're putting pencil to paper and you're doing something. So the idea used to be that you're one way and you're predominantly that way. But more recent research has actually debunked learning styles. Certainly, you can say, I like to learn visually, and that may be true. That may be your preferred method. But what we do know is that nobody has one learning style, that actually you're going to learn the most if you have information filtered through those three learning styles and you make your brain work for it. So anytime that you're rewriting something, not copying, but rewriting in your own words, or you're discussing something and you're hearing it in a different way from somebody else, that's way more powerful than the method that most kids use, which is rereading. So hope this was helpful. Thank you all so much for attending. If you have any questions, contact me at any time, Ann at ectutoring.com. Have a great day. Thank you.